Mary was setting up her basket shop at the farmer's market on a bright sunny day. She is a young and beautiful Amish girl with a heart as pure as the hand-woven baskets she sold. It was a picture of innocence and simplicity. Until it wasn't. Because what Mary didn't know was that trouble was rolling into the market. Suddenly, the peaceful clip-clop of a horse-drawn carriage was drowned out by the thunderous roar of motorcycles. A gang of bikers pulled up, their engines growling like beasts marking their territory. They were loud, crude, and unapologetically intimidating. Tattoos covered their arms, leather jackets gleamed in the sun, and their laughter was the kind that made people cross the street without looking back. The leader, Jake, was the kind of man who thrived on making others feel small, arrogant, with a cruel smirk that hinted at how much he enjoyed being feared. As they stomped through the market, the cheerful chatter quieted, and the air turned heavy with unease. Jake's eyes landed on Mary's booth, and that smirk grew wider. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "What century are you living in, little Miss Pilgrim?" Mary looked up, startled but polite. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked softly. Jake chuckled, a sound that made Samuel step closer to his sister. "Help me? Oh, you've already helped me, sweetheart. This outfit of yours, comedy gold." His gang roared with laughter as Mary's cheeks flushed red. One of the bikers grabbed a loaf of Mary's freshly baked bread, sniffed it mockingly, and then crushed it under his boot, leaving crumbs scattered on the dirt. "Oops," he sneered. "Guess it wasn't sturdy enough for modern life." Mary's hands trembled as she tried to pick up the ruined bread, but Jake wasn't done. He leaned closer, towering over her with that same cruel grin. "What else you got here, huh? Maybe something more useful than this old-fashioned junk." That was when Samuel, despite being half Jake's size, stepped forward. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice trembling but determined. Jake turned slowly, his smirk fading into a cold, hard glare. He loomed over Samuel, his voice dripping with menace. "You got something to say, kid? Huh, say it again." The market fell silent. Mary grabbed her brother's arm, her eyes wide with fear. But before Samuel could speak again, something, or someone, stepped in. Because in the distance, a man had been watching. A man who wasn't about to let this go any further. David wasn't the kind of man to stand out in a crowd. Middle-aged, rugged, and quiet. He was the type who preferred to observe rather than speak. A regular at the market, he was known for his kindness, helping vendors load their goods, offering a warm smile to the children who darted between stalls. But there was something about him, a hint of mystery, that left people wondering. Maybe it was the way he moved, deliberate and steady, or the sharpness in his eyes, like he was always calculating, always ready. That morning, David had been buying apples from an elderly farmer when he noticed the commotion near Mary's booth. His sharp gaze caught everything, the mocking laughter, the way Jake towered over the young girl, and the fear in her eyes as her little brother tried to defend her. David's jaw tightened. Then came the sound of Mary's table crashing to the ground. Jake and his gang were no longer content with just taunts. They flipped the table over, sending jars of honey, loaves of bread, and hand-woven baskets scattering across the dirt. Jake picked up one of the baskets, turning it over in his hands like it was a toy. "How much for this piece of junk?" he sneered before tossing it onto the ground, where it landed with a hollow thud. Mary knelt to gather her scattered goods, tears welling in her eyes. Jake leaned closer, grinning cruelly. "What's wrong, little miss? Can't take a joke." But before he could say another word, a calm, firm voice cut through the tension like a knife. "That's enough." All eyes turned to see David, standing tall, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his presence commanding. The bikers froze for a moment, sizing him up. Jake narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you, old man?" David's expression didn't change. "Just someone who's seen more than enough of this nonsense." The crowd, which had been retreating in fear, began to inch closer, drawn by the unexpected confrontation. Jake smirked, his bravado returning. "What's it to you, huh? You looking for trouble?" David's voice was steady, unshaken. "Trouble? I've faced worse than you, son. And I'm still standing." Jake's smirk twisted into a sneer. "Big words for an old man," he said, stepping closer. "Let's see if you can back them up." In a flash, Jake lunged forward, his hand reaching for something in his jacket. The glint of a blade caught the sunlight as gasps rippled through the crowd. But David didn't flinch. With a fluid, practiced motion, he sidestepped Jake's attack and twisted the knife from his hand in a single, seamless move. The blade clattered to the ground, and before Jake could react, David picked it up and calmly handed it to a nearby vendor. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, but Jake wasn't done. Humiliated and enraged, he barked, "Get him!" One of the bikers charged at David, but the veteran was ready. Using precise, calculated movements, he sidestepped the attack, grabbing the biker's arm and flipping him to the ground. The crowd gasped again, their awe at David's skill contrasting with Mary's tears as she clung to Samuel. Another biker swung at David, but he ducked, delivering a sharp elbow to the man's ribs, sending him staggering backward. It wasn't a brawl. It was an art. Every move deliberate, every action efficient. Jake, seething with rage, growled, "You're gonna regret that," as he motioned for the rest of his gang to surround David. The bikers closed in, their numbers overwhelming. David stood his ground, his sharp eyes scanning each of them. And as the tension reached its breaking point, the sound of sirens in the distance cut through the chaos. Would the bikers back down? Or was this about to escalate into something even more dangerous? Jake's sneer widened as he sized David up. "What are you? Some kind of wannabe hero?" David didn't flinch, his voice calm and steady. "No, just someone who's seen enough of men, like you, to know how to handle them." The market fell silent, all eyes on the two men. Jake chuckled, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. David continued, his tone unwavering. "I've dealt with tougher than you, kid. You think intimidation makes you strong. I've seen real strength, the kind that fights to protect, not bully." Subtle hints of his past began to emerge. David didn't elaborate, but the quiet conviction in his voice told a story. In flashes, the audience sees brief glimpses of his past. A younger David in military fatigues, leading his team through the chaos of combat, saving lives, making impossible choices. Now here he stood, a man of peace, but with a presence forged in fire. His calmness wasn't weakness. It was the kind of strength that comes from having nothing left to prove. Jake's bravado faltered. He tried to maintain his tough exterior, but the cracks were showing. The gang, once cocky and brash, now exchanged uncertain glances. Jake snarled, "You don't scare me, old man." But his voice lacked the confidence it had before. David simply stared him down unshaken. Jake, desperate to reclaim his authority, pointed at David. "You and me. Right now. Let's settle this." David sighed, almost as if he pitied the young man. "If that's what it takes to end this, fine." The fight was brief but electric. Jake lunged wildly, his anger clouding his judgment. David, in contrast, moved with precision. Every strike, every block was calculated. He didn't overpower Jake with brute strength. He dismantled him with discipline and skill. Jake hit the ground, clutching his arm, his pride shattered. Around them, the other bikers froze, unsure of what to do. One of them tried to slink away, knocking over a crate of tomatoes in the process. The bright red pulp splattered across the ground, a grotesque contrast to the tension in the air. The crowd began to stir, inspired by David's bravery. The market vendors and bystanders found their courage. "You're not going anywhere," shouted a burly vendor, stepping in front of one of the bikers. Others followed, forming a human barrier around the gang. In the distance, the wail of police sirens grew louder. Jake and his gang exchanged panicked glances. They were cornered, their bravado gone. The police arrived in a flurry of flashing lights and authoritative voices. Jake and his gang were quickly handcuffed, their attempts to resist futile. As Jake was led away, he spat bitterly at David. "You think you've won?" David shook his head, his voice calm but firm. This was never about winning. It was about doing what's right. He glanced toward Mary, who stood with tears in her eyes. "She's the one who won today." The market, once a scene of chaos, began to heal. Vendors and bystanders rallied around Mary and her brother, helping them pick up the scattered remnants of their booth. A young boy approached Mary, holding a handmade bracelet that had fallen during the commotion. "This is yours," he said shyly, placing it in her hand. Mary clutched it tightly, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you." She turned to David, her eyes brimming with tears. "You're like a guardian angel. I don't know how to thank you." David smiled softly. "We all have to look out for each other. That's how we get through." As the sun began to set, the farmers' market returned to its peaceful rhythm. But for those who witnessed the events of that day, something had changed. The lesson was clear. In a world where cruelty exists, it takes courage to stand against it. Kindness, bravery, and the strength of community can overcome even the darkest moments. In a world where bullies thrive, be the person who steps in to make it right.